Welcome to Cinemaholics. I'm John Negroni, and I just watched Saturday Night, and I'm here to give my instant take on that new movie, which, yes, is about the first episode of Saturday Night Live. It's a narrative, though, and we're following a fictionalized version of the 90 minutes leading up to the live airing of that very monumental, that very pivotal first episode of what is now really one of the iconic sketch comedy American classic shows, right? So I guess for these instant takes, you have to remember I'm not here to really review the movie in full, just sort of giving you my instant reaction coming out of the theater. And in terms of that instant reaction, I'm very pleased with what I saw. I had a really good time watching this one. And I definitely have to give some context, though, of course, in terms of what my expectations were. And really my background, too, with the material, right? So for me, I am a big fan of Saturday Night Live. I think I've know as much about Saturday Night Live as I guess the average person, just in terms of that classic era especially. So Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, right? So that first wave of the show. I know there was a movie that kind of covered a little bit of this several years ago. It was a Netflix movie with Will Forte, but I'm blanking on the name of it, actually. That said, I'm not super familiar with the making of the show. I'm really not that familiar with Lorne Michaels, really, as a person. To me, he's just always that Saturday Night Live guy, right? The creator of the show, who's, still today, I think he's almost 80 years old, and he's still the head honcho of Saturday Night Live and all that. So, speaking of all that, that was kind of my introduction to Saturday Night Live. I grew up in the 90s, like a lot of other millennials, and when I was a kid, I would watch all that, and that was a Saturday Night Live, but for kids, and I didn't even realize that it was that. I didn't realize there was an SNL until eventually I learned about that and got super excited because I wanted to watch the adult all that. And that's sort of where my interest in the show really happened. Now, that's not to say I'm some kind of diehard fan or that I know all the lore or any of that stuff. I'm definitely a casual fan over the years. I've come in and out of watching Saturday Night Live. I think at the very most, right, as a kid, I'm watching it during the Chris Farley days and really like the Jimmy Fallon, the Will Ferrell era. And I was definitely, tuning in here and there over the 2000s when, and then when Kristen Wiig and Jason Sudeikis, Lonely Island, that's like when I'm coming into age is the Andy Samberg skits. And usually what would happen is Saturday Night Live was one of those things that like I knew existed. And every once in a while, I would never really watch an episode. I would just watch clips, or somebody would break out the DVDs of like the classic stuff. And we would sit down and watch the best of Will Ferrell, for example. And then YouTube, of course, made SNL even more something that to this day, like I will go to like YouTube playlists and I'll play a bunch of clips and stuff from different eras of the show just for fun, while I'm playing video games. It's a great video game accompaniment if you have an attention deficit disorder like me. But anyway, so Saturday Night, as I mentioned before, is really catered to not just people who know everything about SNL and just want to enjoy it, like the super fans. I do think it also is trying to maybe pique the interest of more casual fans like me. And I say casual fans, I mean, I still watch modern SNL. I'm not going to say that I'm some kind of staunch defender of it or anything, but I still get a lot of pleasure in the sketch comedy. Even when it bombs, I find it charming. And then every once in a while, a skit comes along that kind of rules, and that's always a fun discovery. But yeah, I stick to it. And a lot of folks who maybe listened to Cinemaholics a few years ago might remember when Will and I used to actually do a lot of sketch comedy for Cinemaholics. We would open the show with sketches that he and I would co-write. And a lot of that really it was and is born from really my just love of the format and SNL just being one of the staples. And of course, there are plenty of other great sketch shows that have come out since, but SNL is one of the greats for sure, and one of the ones that has permeated mainstream culture. In terms of this movie, it's interesting because I went into it not really knowing too much about it. I knew that I knew the concept. I think I caught some glimpses of the trailer, but I didn't pay super close attention. I saw the poster. I knew that I knew that Dylan O'Brien was in it and Ella Hunt was in it, but plenty of other actors I had no idea. Star-studded cast, by the way. I one of the most fun things about this movie, honestly, if nothing else, is just, oh, I know that person. Oh, I know that. Hey, it's J.K. Simmons. Oh, it's Willem Dafoe. I mean, it's just a lot of fun to just see a bunch of people pop up, and I promise I'm leaving out a lot of fun surprises too. And also some of the real life people who I didn't even think were going to be in this, because it's been a while since I've watched that very first episode of SNL. It's been a few years now. And I was like, oh yeah, they would have been there that night. And so that's cool. They have this person playing them. That's how fun is that? So that's a lot of this movie, is just engaging with the cast. But I haven't really got into the nuts and bolts of what this thing is. I feel bad because I'm supposed to be giving an instant take, but I'm still processing, I guess. So you are following basically in real time the 90 minutes leading up to the first episode of SNL. And I mean, look, I wasn't, doing a stopwatch. I couldn't tell you if it was perfectly in real time. I want to assume it was, but who knows? And I can't tell you how authentic this is, and I'm sure they embellished a lot, and I would not be surprised at all if a lot of this was completely made up in terms of some of the wild, crazy stuff that happens. But that's okay. It's the magic of the movies. I think at the very least, they're trying to capture the spirit of what happened. It kind of reminded me a little bit of, it's like a more comedic version of what Danny Boyle did with Jobs, the Steve Jobs biopic with Michael Fassbender, where it's kind of like an Aaron Sorkin, sort of approach to things. But this is not Aaron Sorkin necessarily. I don't want to misconstrue. This is Jason Reitman who directed the movie, and that should make sense to folks who are aware of Jason Reitman's father and some of his connection to all this. But we are really following a young Lorne Michaels, who here is played by Gabriel LaBelle, I think his name is. And if you might recall him as the guy who played a teenage Spielberg in The Fabelmans just a few years ago. And one of the other main characters here is Cooper Hoffman from Licorice Pizza, also from a few years ago. Loved seeing him back. He's the son of Philip Seymour Hoffman, and he is quite terrific in this movie. And what we're really watching is just, it's controlled chaos. It is, think the movie Birdman with Michael Keaton, but it's not one take, but it is sort of in that real time. We're just sort of moving around the set of SNL. Wild, chaotic things are happening. Characters are just basically getting high. They're cussing. They're joking around. They're goofing. They're having fun. And it's all within the backdrop of whether or not they can actually make this show work. And there's something just really plucky about that. It's a nice kind of reminder of that old spirit of SNL. It might ignite, a lot of people to maybe go back to those early episodes again and rewatch them. I mean, if you watch this movie and don't want to watch the first episode of SNL, first of all, the movie would have failed you. But I know that's not how it was for me. I was just anxious. I'm on my way, out of the theater, and I'm just like, man, I just really want to watch the first episode of SNL now, because it was just kind of it was a lot of fun, kind of getting so many insights right into what the mood must have been like leading up to it, even if it's a lot of it's made up. Who knows? You have a lot of actors here who I wasn't expecting to see. Nicholas Braun is in here, and I don't want to say who he plays, because when I saw him, I thought it was supposed to be kind of a surprise moment, but he actually plays two characters. And you have a few folks. I mentioned Dylan O'Brien. He plays Dan Aykroyd, and there's also Matt Wood, I think his name is, playing John Belushi, and he just nails it. I mean, I'm watching it, I'm wondering, like, are they like using CGI like to make him look more like John Belushi? It's kind of uncanny. And also, I forget his name. He's an actor I've seen in a few things before, but Dean Michael something maybe. I'm so sorry, but he plays Chevy Chase, and he also does quite a good job with Chevy Chase. That said, not all the performances are spot on. I didn't love Dylan O'Brien's Dan Aykroyd. Some of it worked. Some of it, I was like, I just see Dylan O'Brien. Like, I don't see Dan Aykroyd. Matthew Rhys plays George Carlin. He's not in a lot of it, but same kind of thing. As soon as he takes his glasses off and you're like, oh, that's Matthew Rhys. That's not George Carlin. So some of the casting, it doesn't quite work. It's a weird criticism, I guess, because that's not the point. And I think that they are, in the spirit of SNL, trying to do impressions. And again, in the spirit of SNL, not all of the impressions are as good as some of the others. Tommy Dewey does a pretty good job here. He kind of anchors the show as one of the lead writers, and I could go on and on. I mean, Willem Dafoe just really, he's this Ike Perlmutter type. He's playing, I think, Larry Tabbitt was his name, like the head of NBC or whatever. And, he's kind of our villain. He's our, the show better be good or it's canceled. And of course you're watching and you know how it's going to end, but it's just one of those scrappy, hey, all we have is some bubble gum and paper clips. Maybe we can make this work. And I'm a sucker for that kind of movie. It has a lot of good laughs in it. Some of the laughs it's interesting because you could sort of tell it's humor from the 1970s. And so it's not going to be as funny for us. Some of it's pretty timeless, but a lot of it isn't. And when you're watching it, I think the movie is smart enough to realize that it's not really about whether or not you're laughing. It's more about the people watching this happen in not really the audience, but the crew, because they do a lot of dress rehearsals, right? So you get glimpses of a lot of the sketches before they went live. And what you'll see is like some of the people who are shooting it and who are kind of, skeptical about this. They're like, what is this show? What the heck? And then they see John Belushi doing something wild and wacky, and then they start laughing. And even if you're watching it and it's not that funny to you because maybe, the jokes are so old fashioned, you might just be like, okay, well, I'm still watching this movie. I'm getting into it. A lot of the humor more is when they're behind the scenes. They're in the hallways, they're in the writers' rooms, and they're cracking jokes at each other's expense. And that's where it's funny. And even more than that, I think that the whole message of this thing of, just trying to make it, to be a counterculture show, to do something innovative when everybody's telling you you're going to fail. I really like stories like that. It's a little weird because just look at modern SNL. It's not that anymore. And maybe that's okay. I don't think SNL could have stayed that way forever. Now it's mainstream. Now it's something where you don't have a bunch of unknowns, in their 20s. You kind of have a mix, and it's still, it has its place, I think, but it's kind of like Simpsons. It really ended for most people after about 7 years. And SNL has way more years than that to hang its hat on, and it has different generations it caters to. So this isn't an instant take of SNL necessarily, but that's just all to say that different people might have different reactions to this based on their SNL baggage. And if you're somebody who maybe bemoans modern SNL, you might be even more favorable with this because it's really celebrating maybe an era that you're more partial to. I don't know. But yeah, it's a crowd pleaser in a lot of ways. I think that the fact that the pacing is so frenetic, it's a short movie, it's a great cast. It's an easy one, I think, to recommend to folks who are into this kind of movie. It's definitely not slow, and it definitely has a lot of fun stuff going on. I don't know if it's the most rewatchable movie. I don't know if it has a ton of lasting power. I'm a little curious about why it got some very negative reactions in the film festival circuit. I think some critics were pretty vicious with this one. I haven't looked at what they've been saying. I just saw some general sort of like, oh yeah, it's not very good. But I want to see some of that for myself because I'm genuinely curious why it might not have been working for some other folks. I brought up some of my own criticisms, and the metatextualness of it is kind of a criticism unto itself, I guess. But in terms of this instant take and just sort of giving you my surface level thoughts, easy recommend. I like Saturday Night. I definitely walked out of the theater happy I saw it, and looking forward to maybe watching it one more time before we get to the voting award season to make sure it really sticks with me. So hopefully Will is going to be able, I think Will is going to be seeing the movie as well. That's Will Ashton, my co-host, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about the film together. And I'd love to hear his thoughts because he is, I would say, a bigger fan of SNL than I am in terms of its glory days. And so I would be very curious his reaction because I think he knows a lot more of the lore and background material than I do. So very, very ready to get his take as well. So thanks again for listening to Cinemaholics. Be sure to subscribe and do all that fun stuff. You know what to do. We'll see you soon, and bye.